Chapter 1. The Boy Who Wasn't Meant to Be King. In the soft golden light of Eltham Palace, where the tapestries caught the morning sun and the polished floors echoed with gentle footsteps, a second son wandered through royal halls without the weight of expectation. Young Henry Tudor, fair-haired, broad-shouldered, spirited, was not raised for the crown. He was born in the glow of another's destiny, meant to support, not to lead. His brother, Prince Arthur, the Prince of Wales, bore the hopes of a dynasty rebuilt from civil war. And so, Henry lived as many second sons did, adored, indulged, free. Eltham was more than a palace. It was a cradle of innocence, surrounded by women who doted on him, his mother Elizabeth of York, his sisters, his grandmother Margaret Beaufort. Henry grew in warmth and song. There were days of learning and laughter, of chasing dogs across the lawns and composing little songs for court musicians to hum. Tutors came and went, filling his young mind with Latin and scripture, history and art. But it was in the tilt yard where his heart quickened. He took to swordplay with fire in his blood, and to music with equal grace, as if born with strings woven into his soul. He was handsome even then. Observers noted his elegance, his charm, his wit. And though he was not the heir, he was treated as something precious, not because he would rule, but because he radiated the potential to captivate, to inspire. As he grew taller, stronger, his mind sharpened, Henry could argue theology with priests and ride like a knight. Still, the throne was never his concern. His path, it seemed, would be one of service and splendor beneath Arthur's shadow. But history, like a river swollen by an unseen storm, would change course. A brother's shadow, Arthur Tudor was everything a Tudor prince was meant to be. His name, drawn from the ancient legends of Camelot, carried the weight of prophecy. Pale and solemn, dutiful and learned, Arthur bore the expectations of a kingdom still recovering from the Wars of the Roses. He was raised for kingship, trained to rule, trained to unite. When he was married at 15 to the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, it was seen as the sealing of a glorious future, a golden prince and a royal bride. It was a union meant to bind nations and ensure peace. Henry watched from behind the veil of ceremony. He admired his brother, but the two boys had never been especially close. Their lives had been divided. Early, Arthur sent to Ludlow to learn governance. Henry kept near the court, more a prince of pageants than policy. Yet even from afar, Arthur's presence loomed. Henry was not envious, perhaps even relieved. He had freedom to study, to spar, to sing, to be charming without the constant press of duty. But in April of 1502, as spring brushed the trees with green and the palace gardens stirred with birdsong, news arrived like a frost. Arthur was dead. A sudden illness. The sweating sickness, they said. A fever that took him swiftly, leaving only silence in its place. The heir of England, gone at 15. The Prince of Wales, no more. Henry, just 10 years old, was now the only surviving son of King Henry VII. The world around him shifted like a great wall of stone moving in the earth. The smiles that once greeted him with lightness now carried weight. The warmth of indulgence cooled into the chill of expectation. His tutors now watched him with sharper eyes. His father, always distant, now leaned in. The boy, who had never been meant to rule, was now the future of England. In that quiet aftermath, something changed in Henry. The games grew less frequent, the laughter more restrained. The world had grown more serious, and the boy had no choice but to follow. A marriage proposed by death. In the wake of Arthur's passing, a question began to bloom like smoke. What would become of his young widow? Catherine of Aragon, then just 16, remained in England. Her dowry only half paid, her future uncertain. And though her marriage had lasted only a few short months, her presence was a political bond too valuable to discard. King Henry VII, ever cautious, began to consider an unusual proposal, that Catherine might marry Arthur's younger brother, a bold solution. But beneath the surface lay thornier concerns. Canon law forbade a man from marrying his brother's wife, citing ancient scripture. And though Catherine claimed the marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, the truth, hidden in shadow, remained a matter of debate. Still, politics often bend what scripture binds. Negotiations began, slow, careful, shrouded in diplomatic language. A papal dispensation was requested to allow the marriage, should it come to pass. In Spain, Catherine's parents agreed. In England, the possibility grew more real. For young Henry, this proposal was both distant and intimate. He had known Catherine only as his brother's bride, regal, graceful, kind. Now the thought of marrying her felt strange, even taboo. But kings are not afforded the luxury of following only their hearts. Duty walks beside them, whispering always. And so the years passed. Catherine remained in England, living modestly, waiting. Henry studied. He grew into manhood, tall and powerful, a king in the making. And though the future was not yet clear, the path was forming, one paved by the echoes of a brother's death. The rise of a young king, the spring of 1509, came with blossoms and a change of fate. King Henry VII, worn by years of rule, passed from the world. With his death, the crown passed not to the prince, long prepared for it, but to the son who had once lived in his shadow. At 17, Henry became King of England. The coronation was not merely a ceremony, it was a revelation. The people rejoiced. Gone was the cold, calculating king of old. In his place stood a young monarch with fire in his eyes, music in his soul, and the bloom of youth upon him. Tall, handsome, athletic, Henry VIII appeared as the very image of divine right. It was said that when he walked through the streets, even the elderly found strength to stand and cheer. His first act as king was swift. He married Catherine of Aragon. The ceremony was quiet, respectful, a union that honored both memory and necessity. Days later, they were crowned together at Westminster Abbey, glittering with cloth of gold and crowned by the hopes of a new generation. Catherine, dignified and radiant, walked beside him not as the ghost of his brother's past, but as a queen of her own right. The court came alive under Henry's gaze. Music, feasting, tournaments, all flourished in a bloom of colour and splendour. It was a time of promise, a golden dawn. The boy who had not been meant to rule now ruled with joy. He forgave debts. He welcomed old enemies. He spoke of peace, but dreamed of glory, and yet beneath the revelry the weight remained. The crown was no longer an idea. It was a burden worn upon his brow. Every decision mattered. Every glance was noted. The kingdom watched him, hoping, expecting. In those early days, it seemed that Henry might be the ideal king. He had the mind, the charm, the strength. But as history would soon reveal, a crown may glitter, but it does not lighten. Its weight grows heavier with time, with failure, with fear. For now, though, the young king stood tall. The winds of fate had chosen him, and England, holding its breath, believed. And so began the reign of Henry VIII, a reign born not from destiny, but from the silence left by death. A reign that would change the soul of a kingdom. A reign whose echoes still linger like footsteps in a long and shadowed hall. Chapter 2. Catherine of Aragon, the First and the Faithful. She arrived not with thunder, but with dignity. The wind over the English coast carried the scent of sea and change as the Spanish princess stepped onto foreign soil. Her name was Catalina, but in England they would call her Catherine, daughter of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, raised beneath a Catholic sky of conquest and courtly devotion. At just 16, her dark eyes held both innocence and resolution, for though she came to wed a prince, her fate would soon bend toward a crown. England was a colder land, both in air and in temperament, but Catherine brought warmth with her. She had been groomed from childhood to marry royalty, instructed in Latin and diplomacy, theology and music. She had knelt beside her mother during royal processions, watched armies form, heard prayers rise in stone cathedrals. Yet here, in England, the path would be different than anyone had planned. Her husband, Prince Arthur, heir to the Tudor throne, was polite but frail. Their marriage lasted just a few short months. Then came sickness and death. Arthur faded like a candle caught in wind, leaving Catherine a widow in a country that was not her own. A life meant to bloom was suddenly frozen in uncertainty. Still, she did not leave. The dowry remained unsettled. The alliance between Spain and England still desired. And quietly, amid political hesitation and ecclesiastical debate, the idea took root that Catherine might marry Arthur's younger brother, Prince Henry. He was 5 years her junior, broad-shouldered, laughing, and curious. A second son turned heir. Years passed. Negotiations lingered. But Catherine remained, not as queen, not yet, but as a symbol of what might be. Then, in the spring of 1509, King Henry VII died, and everything changed. Within weeks, Henry VIII ascended the throne, young, charismatic, full of promise. And Catherine, no longer a widow waiting in shadows, became his queen. Their wedding was quiet, but their coronation would be remembered as golden. A love that seemed divine. The morning of the coronation broke beneath skies brushed with silver mist. London stirred with celebration, and Westminster Abbey, draped in tapestries and holy banners, stood ready to witness the joining of two young monarchs. Henry and Catherine walked side by side, radiant and regal, crowned with hopes as high as the vaulted ceiling above them. They looked for a time like the perfect pair. He, tall, athletic, exuberant, was England's vibrant new sovereign. She, elegant, composed, deeply intelligent, brought with her the solemnity of the Spanish court and the quiet power of her mother's legacy. Together, they seemed like figures from legend, a warrior king and a queen of faith and grace. Their court became the envy of Europe. Music filled the halls. Jousts thundered beneath banners bearing lions and leopards. Feasts dazzled with silver goblets and golden cloth. Henry composed songs for Catherine. She wrote letters in 6 languages. Ambassadors spoke of their unity with admiration. Artists painted them side by side, serene and strong. And beneath the celebration, there was partnership. In matters of state, Henry trusted Catherine. When he rode to war, he left her as regent, confident in her wisdom and judgment. She moved through court with calm assurance, loved by the people, respected by nobles, admired for her piety and learning. To many, she was more than queen. She was the heart of England. They prayed together, dined together, laughed together. And when Catherine became pregnant, bells rang from every church. A son was coming, they believed. The future was secure. But in quiet chambers behind the pageantry, something deeper stirred. Something that would come to define their legacy, not in gold, but in grief. The unseen grief of the nursery. The rooms prepared for royal children were always bright, with tapestries of saints and scenes from holy books, with cradles carved from oak, with nurses waiting to serve. But too often, the nursery at court remained silent. Catherine, though fertile in spirit and strong in resolve, faced sorrow no queen should endure. Her first child, a daughter, died within days. Her second, a son, the long-awaited heir, lived only 7 weeks. Time and again, her body carried hope, only to lose it. Miscarriages followed, then stillbirths. Every loss was whispered about behind tapestries and echoed through the palace like a sorrowful hymn. And yet, she endured. With each pregnancy, she greeted the world with renewed faith. She lit candles at altars. She knelt in solemn chapels. She bore her anguish with the silent dignity of a woman who had been taught that royalty meant sacrifice. The court never saw her weep in public, but those closest to her knew the cost of each empty cradle. In February 1516, after years of sorrow, a child lived. A daughter, Mary. Born healthy and whole, she became the jewel of her mother's heart. Catherine clung to her with fierce love, teaching her the faith and strength she herself had lived by. Mary, small and sharp-eyed, would grow under the shadow of her mother's piety. But though Henry loved Mary, the old need remained, the desire for a son, a boy to carry the name, the crown, the Tudor future. And with every year that passed without one, the golden glow of the early years began to dim. Catherine prayed. She continued to rule with wisdom and speak with grace. But behind her calm voice was a storm of longing and resignation, a sorrow known only to mothers who outlive the children they never truly met. A queen left, waiting. The seasons turned. New faces appeared at court, younger, livelier, bolder. Henry, once so tender, now grew distant. His gaze shifted from Catherine, his attention drawn to tournaments, to alliances, to women with eyes that sparkled differently than hers. Catherine, still devoted, still loving, began to feel the quiet of absence. She had given him her youth, her love, her loyalty, and a daughter, but not a son. And though Henry never spoke his disappointment cruelly, it was there in every decision he made without her. In every moment, he looked through her instead of at her. The court whispered. Rumors of mistresses, of doubts about their marriage, of questions raised in private letters and over glasses of wine. Catherine, however, held firm. Her faith was unshaken. Her role was sacred. She had been crowned queen, anointed by holy oil, bound not only by law, but by divine right. No matter what the king believed, she was his true wife. Still the dinners grew colder, the music more distant, the silences longer, and the woman who had once walked beside him now walked behind. Yet she never faltered, even as Henry's heart wandered, even as he began to seek ways to be free of her. Catherine remained what she had always been, a queen. Her prayers continued. Her love for Mary never wavered. Her commitment to the people endured. She stood not with anger, but with quiet sorrow, watching a marriage dissolve, not with fire, but with fading light. In the end, Catherine of Aragon was more than Henry's first wife. She was his mirror, reflecting both the nobility of his early reign and the fracture that would follow. She was the queen who waited, not for love to return, but for the truth to be remembered. And in that waiting, she became timeless, a figure of faith, of loss, and of enduring grace. Chapter 3: The Great Matter. It began in whispers, not in courts or in chapels, but in the quiet places of the king's thoughts. By the early 1520s, Henry VIII was no longer the radiant youth who had once married Catherine of Aragon beneath the spires of Westminster. The years had brought both splendour and sorrow, and in the shadow of lost sons and the long, unchanging weight of childless expectation, a doubt began to take root. It crept in slowly, like ivy on stone, soft at first, then suffocating. Was it guilt, or was it restlessness? Did Henry truly believe his marriage was cursed by God? Or did he simply long for a future Catherine could no longer give? In the pages of Leviticus, he found a sentence that stirred something within him. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. The verse echoed again and again, until it no longer seemed like scripture, but warning. Perhaps Henry's conscience did awaken, or perhaps, in his palace of power and possibility, ambition cloaked itself in righteousness. Either way, his mind was set. His marriage, long, loving, and holy in the eyes of the church, now felt like a mistake. Not to his heart, but to his legacy. England needed a male heir. A daughter, no matter how brilliant, could not anchor a dynasty so newly built, and Catherine, nearing 40, could no longer bear children. Henry saw the future not as a road, but as a wall, and on the other side, a kingdom slipping from his grasp. So, he made a decision. He would seek an annulment, not a divorce born of bitterness, but a holy correction. The marriage, he insisted, had never been valid, and thus began what would come to be called the Great Matter, a storm of conscience, court, and kingdom that would break the very soul of England. Anne Boleyn, the new flame. She was not like the others. Anne Boleyn entered the king's gaze as a shadow first, a lady in waiting, clever and quiet, newly returned from the polished courts of France. Her presence shimmered, not with beauty alone, but with sharpness. Her words carried wit, her manners an edge. She dressed in darker colours, spoke with a foreign lilt, and looked Henry not with worship, but challenge, and that more than anything captivated him. At first, she resisted. She would not be his mistress. She would not follow in her sister's footsteps, nor become a forgotten name in a royal ledger. If Henry wanted her, truly wanted her, he would have to make her queen. This refusal ignited something in Henry's blood. Anne became not just a woman, but a flame that danced beyond reach. Letters passed between them, filled with longing, with adoration, with promises Henry scarcely understood himself. Anne did not seduce with softness, but with certainty. She was not passive, she was a force. As the seasons passed, the Queen, Catherine, faded quietly into the background. Still devout, still dutiful, but now distant. Anne stood at the centre of Henry's orbit, not yet crowned, but already commanding. To Henry, Anne represented everything he had lost: youth, possibility, and the promise of a son. He did not see the danger, only the light. And so, desire wove itself into destiny. Anne was no longer just a lady of the court. She was the catalyst for revolution, a living reason to defy the past, to remake the present, and to risk everything for a future not yet written. A pope, held hostage. Henry's request for annulment should have been simple. Kings had secured such things before. The Pope had power to dispense, to absolve, to allow, especially when the political winds were favorable. But in Henry's case, the winds had turned against him. For Catherine of Aragon was not merely his wife. She was also the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of vast lands and unmatched armies. And in the year Henry sent his request to Rome, Charles's forces had done the unthinkable. They had sacked the city itself. Rome burned. The Pope was taken prisoner. The Holy Father, Clement VII, was no longer a sovereign voice, but a hostage in his own Vatican. Under the iron watch of Catherine's powerful nephew, no annulment would come. Not now, not ever. Henry waited, then pressed. His ambassadors in Rome pleaded. His scholars at home compiled arguments. But the answers from the Vatican grew colder, slower, more evasive. Time, once Henry's ally, now turned against him. Anne's patience wore thin. The court began to fracture. Some supported the Queen, others the King's new desire. What had begun as a private matter of conscience had become a storm pulling all of Europe into its path. Henry grew restless, angry, desperate. The Pope, who once praised him as defender of the faith, now seemed like a distant enemy. Henry, still loyal to the Church in doctrine, began to dream of a different authority, one not bound by Rome's chains. As years passed without resolution, Henry's eyes turned inward. If the Pope would not grant him justice, perhaps he would become his own judge. And with that thought, a kingdom began to split. Wolsey's fall, Cranmer's rise. For a time, Henry had placed his trust in one man, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, a son of a butcher who had risen to the highest ranks of power. Wolsey was cunning, capable, and, until now, indispensable. He had served the king faithfully, commanding both church and state with a velvet hand. But he failed. He could not deliver the annulment. All his diplomacy, all his grandeur, came to nothing. And when a king cannot strike Rome, he strikes those nearest to him. Wolsey was dismissed, stripped of titles, lands, and hope. Before he could be brought to trial, he died in disgrace. A man who had once whispered into the king's ear now lay forgotten, buried not in honor but in regret. In the vacuum he left behind, another voice rose, quieter, leaner, sharper, Thomas Cranmer. Unlike Wolsey, Cranmer was not. Chapter 4. Anne Boleyn, the Queen of Fire and Glass. The halls of Whitehall fell strangely silent the morning Henry VIII made his final vow. Not before an altar or under a golden arch, but in the private chapel of a shadowed palace, where secrecy cloaked the walls like mist. It was January 1533, and the King of England had done what kings were not supposed to do. He had married Anne Boleyn in secret. No choir sang, no cannons roared. Only the candlelight flickered, and the weight of their choice lingered in the still air. It was an act born of obsession, of fire that refused to cool. Anne was not just a mistress or a court favorite. She was the reason Henry had torn his kingdom from the Pope's embrace. Anne entered this union not as a girl chasing fantasy, but as a woman who understood the stakes. She had waited for nearly 7 years while Henry petitioned Rome, and England held its breath. In the silence of that clandestine wedding, she became both queen and symbol, an emblem of change, rebellion, and desire. Soon after, her swelling belly gave Henry urgency, and he declared the marriage publicly. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, pronounced their union valid. Catherine of Aragon was cast aside. Anne was crowned queen in a ceremony of dazzling splendor, a pregnant queen anointed with oil, cloaked in crimson, walking the long aisle of Westminster Abbey like a sunbeam defying tradition. But the triumph had a shadow. Many turned their eyes away. Some refused to speak her name. For every rose strewn before her feet, there was a thorn pressed into her future. She had everything, and yet nothing was certain. The crown rested on her brow, but it sat on cracked glass. One misstep, and the fragile world she walked might break beneath her feet. The birth of a future queen. On the 7th of September, 1533, beneath tapestries embroidered with Tudor roses and the golden falcon of Anne's own crest, a cry pierced the air in Greenwich Palace. Anne had given birth, not to a longed-for prince, but to a daughter, Elizabeth. Not the son Henry had prayed for, not the male heir who would quiet the doubts of an uncertain court, but a healthy, brilliant girl with a strong wail and eyes that watched the world with uncanny alertness. Henry masked his disappointment behind a half-smile, but something shifted within him. He named the child Elizabeth, perhaps after his own mother, and had her christened with pomp and pageantry. Yet in private, the shadows returned. This was not the son that justified the break from Rome. This was not the living proof of divine favor. For Anne, who had once enchanted Henry with every glance and word, the air around her began to cool. She held her daughter close and whispered lullabies in French and English, hoping the future might yet belong to her. Anne saw something in Elizabeth, something fierce and bright, a flame that might yet outlast kings. But the court saw only failure, and worse, with each failed pregnancy that followed, each silent chamber, each cradle left empty, Anne's position grew more fragile. The queen who had once captivated Henry with her wit and eyes now found herself walking carefully through rooms that once welcomed her. Her body, once prized for its promise, now betrayed her, and she felt it. The glances, the silences, the slight curve of Henry's mouth that no longer turned up at the sight of her. Still, she did not yield. Anne had climbed too far to bend now. She dressed with fire, spoke with sharpness, and clung to her daughter as both shield and legacy. But the pressure was mounting, and the court, ever hungry, began to murmur, a court of enemies. To be brilliant is to be alone. Anne Boleyn was both. At a court built on flattery and masks, she refused to play demure. Her words were arrows, and she rarely missed her mark. She did not soothe egos, she sliced through them. And while her intelligence dazzled, it also isolated. The nobles who once pretended to adore her now found comfort in turning away. Her enemies were not always loud, but they were patient. Courtiers like Thomas Cromwell took careful note of her boldness, her arrogance, her inability to smile and nod when insulted. Even Henry, once bewitched by her mind, now winced when her opinions crossed his own. Rumors slithered through corridors like smoke under doors, that Anne used sorcery to seduce the king, that she flirted with musicians and poets, that she laughed too freely with her brother George, that her pride exceeded even her station. It did not matter if the whispers were false. Repetition turned smoke into fog, and in fog, even lies take form. She had allies still. Her brother, her father, a few loyal ladies-in-waiting, but they were growing fewer. Her failure to produce a son made her vulnerable, and her sharpness made her enemies bold. She had changed England's church, altered its history, but history does not repay favors. It forgets kindness and remembers offense. Anne walked the palace, halls with her chin high, but her steps grew quieter. She knew the eyes watching her were no longer enchanted. They were waiting for her to slip, for the glass to shatter. And behind those eyes, Henry's own gaze was changing. He had once looked at her like a miracle. Now, he watched her like a problem waiting to be solved. A fall as swift as her rise. In May of 1536, the wind turned cruel. Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, accusations as brutal as they were absurd. She was accused of seducing not just courtiers, but her own brother, of plotting against the king, of crimes unthinkable for a queen. The men accused alongside her were brought in chains. Some confessed under torture, others denied until death. But Anne, taken to the Tower of London, stood before her judges with clarity, dignity, and calm disbelief. She asked for mercy, not for herself, but for the truth. But the trial was not meant for justice. It was a ritual, carefully orchestrated, meant to bring down a queen. On the morning of her execution, she dressed simply, choosing a gown of grey and red. She walked to the scaffold with grace, pausing, only once to lift her eyes to the sky. The crowd gathered, hushed and unsure. Some had come out of loyalty, others out of curiosity, and some out of cruelty. Anne spoke softly. She did not protest her innocence. She did not curse the king. Instead, she prayed for him. "I die His Majesty's faithful servant," she said, "and God preserve him." She knelt on the scaffold. A French swordsman, brought in for his precision and speed, stood ready. There was no scream, only a breath, then silence. The queen, who once wore fire like a crown, had been broken like glass. But as her body was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, something stirred in the future she had given birth to. Elizabeth, her daughter, would one day wear the crown not as her mother had, through defiance, but through destiny. Anne Boleyn died a woman undone by ambition, by a nation not ready for her, and by a man whose love was as fierce as his cruelty. But history remembers her not just for her fall, but for the spark she left behind. A spark that would light the reign of a queen who changed the world. And so ends the story of Anne Boleyn. Bold, brilliant, broken, and eternal. The Queen of Fire and Glass. Chapter 5. Jane Seymour. The Gentle Rose. After the whirlwind that had been Anne Boleyn, her rise like fire, her fall like shattered glass, there came a hush, a pause in the court's breath, as though the great palace itself needed time to settle. And into that silence stepped Jane Seymour, not with a flourish or fanfare, but with the gentle rhythm of a prayer whispered at dusk. She was no thunderclap, no trumpet announced her heart. Jane came like mist over a garden, calm and cool and still. Where Anne had spoken sharply and moved with fire, Jane bowed her head and folded her hands. Her eyes held softness, her manner spoke of duty, and her presence soothed the king like balm over old wounds. Henry, still bruised from the chaos that had consumed Anne's final days, turned to Jane as one might turn to water after walking through flame. She had served quietly in Catherine of Aragon's household, and later in Anne Boleyn's. She had watched from the edges of power, learning its rhythm without reaching for its center. She had been no one's favorite, and that made her safe. She had no enemies and no ambitions, at least none she wore outwardly. What she offered Henry was not passion but peace, and it was that peace, that soft constancy, which drew him. Jane said little, but meant much. She did not argue, she did not provoke, and in her silence, Henry found the illusion of control. the court saw a woman who walked like shadow, who did not seek attention, and who seemed to want only to serve. To Henry, that was enough. Their courtship was short. There was no long siege of the heart, no years of waiting. Just weeks after Anne's death, Jane was engaged to the king. By May 1536, they were married. The ink on Anne's death warrant was barely dry, but Jane said nothing. She accepted her crown with grace, and when she walked into court as queen, the people did not cheer, but they did not resist. After the fire and fury, England was ready for quiet. Jane gave them that. The son is born. In October of 1537, the sound that Henry had waited years to hear at last broke through the thick stone of Hampton Court. It was the cry of a son, a boy, a prince, Edward Tudor. Jane had done what neither Catherine nor Anne could. She had given Henry a male heir, a future king, a living thread to carry on the Tudor name. The palace erupted in relief. Bells rang across the land, feasts were held, prayers were said. Henry, for the first time in many years, smiled without reservation. His line was secure. His reign had meaning. He looked into the face of his infant son and saw not only victory, but validation. All he had sacrificed, wives, friends, the church itself, seemed justified in this tiny child. Jane had endured a long and painful labor, lasting 2 days and nights. But she had not cried out. She bore the agony with the same silent grace she carried through life. When Edward was placed in her arms, she smiled, faintly, serenely. She had fulfilled her purpose. She had done what queens were meant to do. There was no triumph in her tone, no boastful pride, only quiet satisfaction. The baby was strong. Jane, pale and drained, still whispered blessings over him. She knew how precious this gift was, not just to Henry, but to England. The court celebrated around her. Musicians played, nobles toasted, the kingdom rejoiced. But in Jane's chamber, the air grew still again. A shadow returned. Her body, pushed beyond its limit, began to falter. But for that moment, just one moment, she was the most honored woman in England. The rose that had bloomed in silence had now given life to the throne. A death in giving life. Not 2 weeks passed before the celebration gave way to mourning. Jane, who had endured her trial with such strength, began to fade. Childbed fever took root, slow at first, then swift. The same body that had borne a king's future could not sustain its own. Henry watched, helpless. He had won his prize, and now it was slipping through his fingers. He stood at her bedside, silent as the physicians whispered grimly, and the candles burned lower with each passing hour. Jane, ever calm, accepted her fate without complaint. Her breath slowed, her hands grew cold, but her eyes stayed soft. She had always known that this was possible. She had lived without demand, and now she died without protest. When she slipped away, the room seemed to hold its breath. The new prince was just days old. The queen was gone. Henry did not shout. He did not rage. He retreated. He did not marry. Again for 3 years. A silence that spoke volumes in the life of a king who had once reshaped an entire church for love. Of all his wives, Jane would be the one he called his true queen. The only one to give him what he believed he needed most. And in death, she became untouchable. Beyond scandal, beyond criticism, beyond the bitter games of court. He ordered that she be buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Years later, when death finally came for Henry too, he would be laid beside her, by choice. No other queen would share his grave. In that silent stone tomb, she would lie forever as his eternal companion, the queen who never raised her voice, but changed the course of the crown. The mourning king. In the months after Jane's death, a strange hush fell over Henry. The court resumed its duties. The baby prince was cared for by nurses and nobles, but the king himself seemed dimmed, his voice quieter, his appetite dulled. He who had once burned with fury and obsession now walked the halls with slower steps. Grief touched him in a place deeper than politics. It was not simply the loss of a wife, it was the loss of simplicity, of peace. Jane had been his harbor, his resting place. In her, he had found a softness he did not understand but sorely needed. Now that stillness was gone. Henry withdrew from court festivities. His portraits grew more solemn. He aged visibly. His frame thickened, his eyes narrowed, and his soul seemed heavier. He still ruled, still made decisions with strength and certainty. But something essential had dimmed. He had reached the summit of his ambitions. He had his son, his legacy. But in achieving it, he had lost something human. Jane's death left a hollow in his heart, and though he would take more wives, none would touch him in quite the same way. He clung to her memory, speaking of her with reverence, commissioning paintings, preserving her name as sacred. In the pages of history, she appears briefly, less dramatic than Anne, less tragic than Catherine. But to Henry, Jane Seymour was the quiet in the storm, the gentle rose who bloomed for a moment and left a fragrance that never faded. And perhaps, in the end, that is the truest kind of love. Not the love that burns brightly and consumes, but the one that lingers in silence long after the song has ended. Chapter 6. Anne of Cleves, the unwanted queen. It began, as many royal unions did, with a painting. In a quiet studio in London, the court painter Hans Holbein dipped his brush into fine pigments and set to work on the face of a woman he had never truly met. Her name was Anne of Cleves, daughter of the Duke of a small German territory. And her portrait was not just a likeness. It was a proposal, a canvas bound in diplomacy and the hope of peace. Henry VIII, now past the bloom of his youth and, softened by age and sorrow, was once again in search of a wife. He had grieved Jane Seymour, but a son had been born, and that son needed a mother. More importantly, Henry needed a new alliance, a political partnership that would hold weight across the religious tensions of Europe. The choice fell to Anne of Cleves. She was Protestant, modest, and untouched by scandal. She did not come with grandeur or noble tales, but with promise, a link to the Lutheran world and a buffer against Catholic powers. Her family was well positioned, and she was said to be kind. But it was not enough for Henry to hear these things. He needed to see. So Holbein travelled to Düren, and with careful strokes, he captured Anne's face. The artist was not untruthful, but he was kind. He softened shadows, smoothed lines, and lifted her posture with subtle grace. The portrait returned to Henry in England, and he was charmed. In the painted features, he saw a future, a queen who might bring peace without challenge. He agreed to marry her, sight unseen. Preparations began swiftly. The court buzzed with new life. The king, hopeful once more, looked to the Channel with anticipation. A foreign princess was sailing to be his bride, and though he had not met her, he believed that this time the story might unfold gently. I like her not. Anne landed on English shores in the cold of winter. She was dressed in thick foreign fabrics, her hair braided in the German style, her eyes wide with wonder and uncertainty. She had left her home behind, her language, her customs, all for a man she had never spoken to. Eager and unsure, she prepared to meet Henry, unaware that he had already devised a test. Disguised in ordinary dress, the king arrived unannounced, believing that love, if it were real, would reveal itself in a moment of pure recognition. But Anne, raised in courtly decorum, failed to respond with the passion or submission Henry expected. She greeted him with polite confusion. To her, he was simply another stranger in a strange new world. That moment broke something in Henry. The enchantment of the portrait, the fantasy of political romance, fell away. To his eyes, Anne was plain. Her manners were stiff, her laughter strange. I like her not, he muttered to his advisers. Again and again, the words clung to him. No matter what she said or did, they remained. Yet the wheels of politics turned. The alliance with Cleves was too valuable to abandon lightly. On January 6, 1540, Henry and Anne were married. But there was no joy in the ceremony. The king barely looked at his bride. His smile was tight, his hands cold. The court watched in careful silence. Days turned into weeks. Henry avoided Anne, refusing to consummate the marriage. He complained in private about her body, her speech, her scent. He claimed he could not fulfill his duties. Yet Anne, unaware of the storm beneath the surface, continued to perform her role with quiet dignity. She had not asked to be queen, but she wore the crown with humility. Even as the whispers began, a gracious exit. By summer, the union that had never truly begun was already unraveling. Henry, impatient and embarrassed, sought a way out. His advisors scoured for legal justifications, and Anne, sensing the shift in the air, braced herself. She might have resisted. She might have argued or wept or claimed her rights. But Anne chose another path. When Henry's envoys approached her with news of the annulment, she did not protest. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she nodded, listened, and gave her reply with calm. She accepted. The marriage was annulled on the grounds of non-consummation and a pre-existing betrothal Anne had once made years before. The court declared her no longer queen, but rather than banish her or shame her, Henry made an unusual offer, one born perhaps of guilt or gratitude. Anne would remain in England. She would be given a generous income, her own estate, and the honorary title, the king's sister. She would be welcome at court. She would be treated with respect. Anne accepted it all. She exchanged the title of queen for a life of peace. Where others had lost their heads, she kept hers. Where others had fought the king, she stepped aside. Her grace in the face of rejection became her triumph. In letting go of a throne, she preserved her life and gained a strange, quiet power, a queen who escaped the axe. While the histories of Henry's other wives were marked by tragedy and blood, Anne's story drifted into soft twilight. She lived on, not as a queen, but as a noblewoman of esteem. Her home was Hever Castle, once the childhood estate of Anne Boleyn, and now a place of peaceful retreat. She dressed well, ate richly, and corresponded with foreign dignitaries. She rode in royal processions and was honored as family. Her days were simple, but secure. She never remarried, though suitors came. She never returned to Cleves. England had become her home, a land where she had once been unwelcome, but where, in time, she found her place. Henry would marry again, and again. The throne would see more chaos, more sorrow. But Anne stayed untouched by it all. She had escaped the court's cruel dance. She had stepped out of the shadow just in time. In 1557, Anne of Cleves died at the age of 41. She was buried with respect in Westminster Abbey, an honor no other queen who had lost her title received. And so, the unwanted queen became the most fortunate of them all, not through power, not through beauty, but through grace, through knowing when to yield, through surviving. In the soft hush of history, her name is often passed over, but listen closer, and there she is, a quiet figure in the background, smiling, slightly, untouched by the axe, untouched by ruin. A woman who was never quite loved, but who lived long and well. A portrait may have brought her to the king, but it was wisdom that saved her, and in the end, that may be the rarest gift of all. Chapter 7. Catherine Howard, the Rose Without Thorns. The air at court had changed again, with Anne of Cleves quietly gone and the king once more alone. Something youthful and bright caught his eye. A girl, barely grown with laughter, like wind chimes and cheeks flushed with innocence. Catherine Howard. She was no queen in waiting, not yet. She was young, perhaps just 15 or 16, and her presence was light, like sunlight slipping through curtains. She danced, smiled, and moved with the easy joy of someone untouched by the weight of responsibility. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, not malice. Her voice carried songs, not schemes. Born into the powerful Howard family, Catherine had been raised, more by accident than design, often left in the care of distant relatives, surrounded by other noble girls, watched over with loose discipline. Her days were filled with laughter, whispers, and lessons half learned. She was not trained to be a queen. She was not ready to be a wife to the King of England. But Henry, now aging and heavy with illness, saw in her a revival, a spring breeze to stir the cold chambers of his heart. She was his fifth wife, and she made him feel alive again. She called him her rose without a thorn, and in return he gave her jewels, gowns, and a crown. The court watched with cautious eyes. Some whispered that the girl was too young, too carefree, too unguarded, but no one dared stop the tide. Henry, once again, had found what he thought was love, or at least the illusion of it, and Catherine, wide-eyed and swept into royal life, could hardly see the danger that surrounded her. She wore her crown like a ribbon, lightly, beautifully, but beneath her feet, the ground had already begun to shift. The affair that ended a crown. In the quiet shadows of the court, where eyes still watched from behind tapestries and secrets passed like soft coughs in candlelit corridors, Catherine found what she believed was affection. It began with letters, notes tucked into sleeves, carried by handmaids, exchanged in silence. The man was Thomas Culpeper, handsome, ambitious, and dangerously close to the Queen's chambers. What passed between them was part thrill, part yearning, and entirely reckless. But Catherine had always lived in whispers. Even before her marriage to the king, her youth had been littered with rumors of a music tutor who had pressed too close, of flirtations that went too far. These secrets had slept under rugs and behind locked doors. But court has no patience for buried stories. When word of her affair with Culpeper reached the ears of Archbishop Cranmer, a quiet panic took hold. The king, aging and proud, had risked his dignity on this young bride. To be betrayed by her was not just humiliation, it was treason. Investigations began in silence. Letters were uncovered, testimonies extracted. The walls around Catherine began to close, and the world she danced, through so joyfully, suddenly grew dark and narrow. She was summoned, questioned, cornered. She denied at first, then hesitated, then confessed. Not just to Culpeper, but to her past, to the liaisons that had never truly left her. And in that moment, the child became the condemned. She had stepped into a role meant for women, but she was still a girl. And now, the crown slipped from her head with the quiet chill of betrayal. A trial without mercy. There was no grandeur to her downfall, no fiery speeches, no dramatic last stands. Catherine's trial was more a formality than a process. The evidence was overwhelming, and the king's heart had turned cold. She was charged with treason, not only for her secret meetings with Culpeper, but for having entered marriage under false pretenses, hiding her previous liaisons. Her past became her crime. Her youth, her naivety, her longing, all were used as weapons against her. Culpeper and her former lover, Francis Derham, were executed brutally. Catherine's fate was sealed soon after. She would follow Anne Boleyn, nearly to the letter, a queen to be struck from the throne and from life. On the morning of her execution, February 13th, 1542, Catherine was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. She was still only a teenager. Her hands trembled, her voice was soft. It is said she asked for the executioner's block the night before, to practice laying her head upon it. When she spoke, her words were simple. She admitted guilt, asked for mercy from God, and prayed for the king's long life. She knelt, placed her head down gently, and waited. The blade fell quickly. The rose without thorns had been plucked from the world, not for what she had done alone, but for being too young, too free, and too trusting in a court that did not forgive mistakes. The ghost in the gallery. There is a hallway in Hampton Court where the air feels colder than it should. A long, narrow corridor known as the Haunted Gallery. Tourists walk its polished floors, their footsteps echoing softly. And sometimes, they say, a scream is heard, faint, far away, as though from another time. The legend says that Catherine Howard runs that corridor still, barefoot, terrified, trying to reach the king, calling his name, begging for mercy. She never reaches the door. She never escapes. Whether true or not, her presence lingers. She has become a ghost not just in brick and stone, but in memory, in the way we remember her, not as a villain or seductress, but as a girl lost in the machinery of kings. History moved on. The crown passed to others. The court grew older, more rigid, more hollow. But Catherine remained suspended in time, the only queen of Henry's to die so young, so unprepared, and so alone. She was not a schemer, not a rival, not a warrior, just a girl, a rose without thorns, who bloomed too quickly and was crushed by the weight of a world she never understood. And maybe that's the lesson buried deep in her story, that innocence is not always protection, that even laughter can echo in haunted halls, and that some crowns come not with power, but with sorrow woven into every jewel. Catherine Howard may not have left behind a dynasty, but she left behind a whisper, soft, haunting, and eternal. A cry in the gallery that never truly fades. Chapter 8. Catherine Parr, the Last and the Learned. Before she ever walked the halls of Whitehall, before she ever wore the Tudor rose or felt the weight of a crown upon her head, Catherine Parr had already lived through 2 chapters of love and loss. She was no wide-eyed maiden, no girl pulled into royal intrigue by accident or ambition. She was a woman, measured, mature, and marked by grief. Catherine had been widowed twice. First to Edward Burgh, a quiet, politically safe match that ended in his early death. Then to John Neville, Lord Latimer, whose household was filled with unrest during the Northern rebellions. In both marriages, she had served not only as wife, but as caretaker, manager, and peacemaker. She had known the ache of watching a husband decline. She had known what it meant to lead a home, while others plotted beyond her doors. But what truly shaped her was her mind. Catherine could read and write fluently in Latin, French, and Italian. She had studied scripture deeply, and she followed the shifting religious winds of England with quiet attentiveness. She loved books and ideas, loved the way thoughts could be turned into prayers, and prayers into conviction. By the time Henry V noticed her, Catherine was already in love with Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour. Their courtship had been gentle, full of promise, but when the king set his sights on her, everything changed. She did not choose Henry freely. She chose him as one might choose duty over desire. But within that choice was strength. Catherine understood what others had not. To survive Henry was to outthink him, to soothe him, to outlast him. And so, in 1543, she became his sixth and final wife, a widow twice over, now queen of a court still haunted by the ghosts of 5 other women. A marriage of mind and care. By the time of their marriage, Henry was no longer the golden prince of his youth. He was swollen with age, his leg ulcerated and painful, his temper quick and often cruel. Yet in Catherine's presence, something softened. She did not tempt him with beauty. She did not flatter him with innocence. She brought instead a calm, intelligent grace. She listened. She learned. And above all, she cared. As queen, Catherine became more nurse than consort. She managed his medicine, dressed his wounds, read to him when his mood darkened. In private, they spoke of scripture and the state of the realm. She treated him less like a king and more like a man she had promised to care for until death. And though love may not have bound them, a strange kind of loyalty did. But it was not just Henry she cared for. It was his children, Edward, Elizabeth, and Mary. Catherine became a mother to them all, not by blood, but by spirit. She insisted that they be reunited at court, that they learn together, dine together, and share in the warmth of family once more. She gave Elizabeth books and instruction. She gave Edward guidance in faith. Even Mary, who was slow to trust, found in Catherine a steady hand. The royal children would remember her not for her power, but for her kindness. This was not a marriage of passion. It was a marriage of mind, of will, of care that held back chaos. Catherine did not seek to rule Henry. She sought to calm him, to hold him steady in the twilight of his reign. And in doing so, she gave England something it had not known for years: peace, religious reform, and female voice. In the heart of her quiet chambers, beyond the reach of court gossip and the weight of royal expectation, Catherine Parr wrote, not just letters or prayers, but books, bold, personal, and revolutionary for a woman of her time. Her first work, Prayers or Meditations, was published under her own name, an audacious act in an age when women were expected to remain silent in the world of letters. She was the first Queen of England to publish a book. And it would not be her last. Catherine believed in reform, in the translation of scripture into English, in direct access to faith without priests as gatekeepers. She surrounded herself with scholars and reformers. She debated, listened, questioned, Her beliefs were quiet, but they were unshakable. Yet even in this, she was not safe. In 1546, conservative factions at court sought to destroy her. A warrant for her arrest was prepared, accusing her of heresy. But Catherine, sensing the storm, acted swiftly. She approached Henry with humility, framing her discussions of theology as harmless diversions meant only to soothe his troubled mind. Henry, either flattered or softened, dismissed the charges. The warrant disappeared. The Queen, once again, had survived. But her legacy had taken root. In a court where women were rarely seen as thinkers, Catherine Parr had become a voice, a gentle, graceful voice, for reform, for learning, for faith that belonged as much to women as to men. Her words would echo into the reign of Elizabeth. Her books would shape the future of English piety, and her quiet courage would leave a mark deeper than the crown she wore. The wife who survived. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Catherine Parr did not weep in public. She had watched him decline day by day. She had seen the throne consume his body and darken his soul. With his death came something unexpected: freedom. For the first time in her life, Catherine was her own. No longer a wife under obligation. No longer a widow bound by custom. She was a queen dowager, wealthy, respected, and finally unchained from the demands of kingship. She returned to Thomas Seymour, the man she had loved before Henry, and this time she chose him freely. Their marriage was quick, their union affectionate. They lived at Sudeley Castle, surrounded by books, gardens, and dreams of a quieter life. In her final year, Catherine found joy. She laughed again. She welcomed Elizabeth into her home. And then, something more. Something she had never known before. She became pregnant, but fate, as always, was not kind for long. In September of 1548, after giving birth to a daughter, Catherine fell ill with childbed fever. Days passed in fevered delirium. Her body weakened, her breath shortened, and quietly she slipped away. She had survived Henry. She had outlived 5 queens. She had raised a prince, shaped a princess, and written her own words into the story of England. She was buried at Sudeley Castle, her tomb tucked in the chapel garden. Not in gold, not among kings, but in stone, simple and elegant, just as she had been. Catherine Parr was the last wife, but she was more than that. She was the survivor, the scholar, the voice in the silence. And in her story, something changes. No longer the tale of women undone by power, but of a woman who endured it, shaped it, and quietly, beautifully rose above it. Chapter 9: A Kingdom of Widows and Orphans. When Henry VIII died in January of 1547, he left behind more than a crown. He left behind a kingdom weighed down by silence, by the echo of executions, the memory of broken vows, and the quiet heartbreaks of 6 queens. But above all, he left 3 children. 3 threads spun from 3 different mothers. 3 fates bound by blood and shadow. Edward, Mary, Elizabeth. Each was born of a queen Henry once loved, or claimed to. Each had lived at a distance from the others, pulled apart by politics, suspicion, and the fragile machinery of court. And now, with Henry gone, they were no longer just royal children. They were symbols. Each one, in their own way, stood for a different England. Edward, just 9 years old, was his father's golden hope, the son of Jane Seymour, the prince who had come at such a cost, a boy king crowned in delicate shoes. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, had lived much of her youth in bitterness and fear, declared illegitimate, torn from her mother, forced to renounce her faith to survive. Yet she remained devout, unshakable, and deeply loyal to the old Catholic ways. And Elizabeth, clever, cautious, and observant, had watched the world collapse around her more than once. Daughter of Anne Boleyn, orphaned by the sword, marked by scandal, but shielded by grace, she had learned early how to survive in silence. These three children, born of queens who had loved and lost, now stood in a realm where everything was uncertain. They had different mothers, different faiths, different claims, yet the same name. Tudor England, long accustomed to the heavy shadow of their father, now looked to these orphans to lead it forward. But the path ahead was not paved in unity. It was carved from division. The Widow's War. In the weeks after Henry's death, the court turned its gaze not to his memory, but to the power vacuum he left behind. Amid the shifting alliances and whispered schemes, one woman remained behind. The curtain, Catherine Parr, now a widow once more. Her mourning was quiet, no public lament, no great gesture. She had played her role. She had survived. And now, she returned to the man she had once been forced to leave. Thomas Seymour. Their marriage was swift, too swift for some. Only months after Henry's burial, Catherine and Thomas were wed in secret. Their love, long held in reserve, was finally allowed to bloom, but the joy was fragile, shadowed by court suspicion and hidden ambition. Catherine moved to Sudeley Castle, far from the eyes of London, where she could raise Elizabeth under her care and await the birth of her first child, something she had never known in her previous marriages. She hoped perhaps to begin again, but fate would not allow it. In the summer of 1548, Catherine gave birth to a daughter, and within days, she was dying. Childbed fever took her as it had taken so many women before. The woman who had comforted kings, taught princesses, and written words of wisdom for a changing nation, now lay fading by a window, her body weakened by the very miracle she had hoped for. Her death was quiet. There was no state funeral, no grand procession, just the soft closing of a chapter few had truly understood. Catherine Parr had survived Henry, but she could not survive the peace she had longed for. And as the kingdom moved on without her, she left behind not a throne, but a daughter, a stepdaughter, and a legacy written in ink rather than blood. The short reign of a boy king. Edward VI ascended the throne as a boy of 9. The crown was too heavy for him, both in weight and meaning. He was intelligent and precocious, with a deep love for scripture and learning, but his youth made him vulnerable, not to his people, but to those who ruled in his name. The real power lay in the hands of regents. First, his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, then John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. These men ruled with ambition disguised as duty. They steered policy, reformed the church, and pushed England further from Rome, all in the name of a boy too young to challenge them. Edward, though soft in voice and slight in stature, held firm convictions. He believed in the Protestant cause. He encouraged the Book of Common Prayer. He wanted a nation where scripture was open, not locked behind Latin. But his body, like his reign, was fragile. From his early teens, his health declined, a slow unraveling marked by coughing fits, weakness, and quiet despair. Physicians whispered of consumption. Court rumors swirled. By the age of 15, Edward was dying. He knew it. And in his final months, he tried to shape what would follow. He feared that Mary, his half-sister, a devout Catholic, would undo everything. So he penned a document, My Devise for the Succession, naming Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, as heir. It was a desperate move, guided by advisors who feared losing power. And when Edward finally slipped away in July of 1553, the crown passed not to Mary or Elizabeth, but to a girl who had never asked for it. Edward's reign was brief, 6 years of reform, ceremony, and quiet courage. But like the pages of a book too thin to hold the weight of its message, it ended before it could take root. The heir who wasn't meant to be. Lady Jane Grey was not born to rule. She was a scholar, a quiet soul, raised in strict Protestant devotion, with a mind sharpened by study and a heart untouched by ambition. Yet in the desperate maneuverings of those who feared a Catholic queen, Jane became a pawn, placed on the throne by those who needed her more than she needed power. She was just 16 when she was told she would be queen. She resisted at first, confused, uncertain, but her parents insisted, her advisors assured her, and so she accepted, not with triumph, but with trembling hands. Her reign lasted 9 days. Mary Tudor, bold and unshaken, marched with support. The people, weary of scheming lords and silent boy kings, rallied behind her. She was the daughter of a queen who had suffered for them. She was the rightful heir in their eyes. Jane was imprisoned. Her youth and reluctance might have saved her, had politics not demanded sacrifice. In February of 1554, Lady Jane Grey was led to the scaffold. She was calm, composed. She carried a prayer book in her hands. Blindfolded, she reached for the block and could not find it. "What shall I do?" she whispered. "Where is it?" A hand guided her. She knelt. She prayed. The axe fell. Jane, the 9-day queen, had ruled longer in memory than in life. A quiet girl who died not for ambition, but because others placed their ambition upon her. And in her death, England faced itself, torn between faith and blood, between law and longing. The crown, once worn by Henry with certainty, had become a shifting weight passed from head to head, often too heavy for those who bore it. Closing reflection. By the time Mary Tudor took her seat upon the throne, England was no longer the kingdom it had been under her father. The Reformation had changed its bones. The succession had frayed its fabric, and the children of Henry VIII, scattered, scarred, and still so young, carried the burden of a legacy built on loss. Widows and orphans, queens and ghosts. From Catherine of Aragon to Catherine Parr, from Anne Boleyn to Jane Grey, the women of this story had shaped it with their silence, their strength, their suffering. The sons died early, the daughters remained. And now, with Mary as queen and Elizabeth waiting in the wings, the kingdom stood at a crossroads, haunted by the past, uncertain of the future, but still, somehow, breathing. This was no longer Henry's England. It was something new, something fragile, and the story was not yet finished. Chapter 10. Mary and Elizabeth, the daughters of wives remembered. The rain fell softly on the morning Mary rode into London. Grey skies above, muddied streets below, yet the people pressed close, hands raised, faces alight with something deeper than celebration. They were witnessing history. For the first time, a woman, a true-born daughter of a king, had taken the crown not as consort or ornament, but as sovereign. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was England's first queen regnant. The child who had once been cast aside, declared illegitimate, forced to deny her mother, now held the crown her father had feared to place in female hands. She wore it not with triumph, but with solemn purpose. Mary's path to power had not been easy. After the short and tragic reign of Lady Jane Grey, whom Mary had swiftly unseated, the kingdom trembled beneath religious tension and political uncertainty. But Mary's claim was clear, and the people remembered her mother, the Queen of old, the Spanish princess who had stood tall in sorrow and refused to be forgotten. Now her daughter sat on the throne, and in many ways, Mary reigned for both of them. She restored the Catholic Mass. She rejoined England to Rome. She sought to heal the break her father had torn in pursuit of Anne Boleyn. But time is not so easily reversed. The years had changed the kingdom. Reformation ideas had taken root. The people were not so eager to return to old rituals, to Latin prayers and papal authority. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, meant to strengthen ties with the Catholic world, only deepened unease. He was foreign, cold, and distant. The people feared Spanish rule. They feared loss of their newly kindled independence. And then came the fires. Protestants who would not bend were tried for heresy. Hundreds burned. The smoke rose from Smithfield and Oxford, carrying the scent of fear and resistance. They called her Bloody Mary, though she wept in private. Her reign, born in justice and longing, had turned hard. Her dreams of a Catholic England, of a child in her arms and a husband at her side, withered into illness and disappointment. Mary died in 1558, childless, alone. She left behind a kingdom torn by faith and wearied by flame. Yet her reign, for all its sorrow, opened a door no woman had ever walked through before. She had ruled, fully, unapologetically, and though her memory would be clouded in judgment, the path she cleared would shape the future. Elizabeth rises. When Elizabeth took the crown, the wind in London changed. It was not joy exactly, not at first, but anticipation, a kind of careful hope. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, once declared illegitimate, once whispered about in court shadows, now stood at the gates of power. She was 25, intelligent, wary, shaped by silence and survival. Her mother had died by sword. Her father had shattered kingdoms for love. And yet here she was, a daughter born of scandal, now wrapped in ermine, crowned beneath golden arches. The crowd that watched her coronation was thick and breathless. Trumpets sounded. Processions unfolded with precision. But Elizabeth's eyes remained steady. She knew what this moment meant, not just for herself, but for the memory of a woman whose ghost still walked the halls. Anne Boleyn had been hated, adored, and destroyed. Elizabeth bore that name in every gesture she made, yet she would never speak it aloud. Instead, she rewrote it. Elizabeth ruled with caution and brilliance. She understood the dance of appearances, the balance between power and poise. She would not marry, though countless suitors came. She would not name a king, though Parliament pleaded. She would be England's queen, alone. Her court was vibrant. Poets, explorers, thinkers. It was the age of Shakespeare, of Drake, of global tides shifting. She wielded power with grace, but also with calculation. She managed religion with careful compromise, not fiery reform, nor Catholic return. A Church of England, hers in name and temper. Where Mary had tried to restore the past, Elizabeth embraced the future. She made of her mother's shadow a cloak, no longer shame, but legend. She did not forget Anne. She learned from her. She survived her, and in that survival, she turned a kingdom of wounds into a theatre of wonder. Legacy. Etched in stone, Mary and Elizabeth, two sisters, two queens, daughters of women Henry had once loved, and later cast aside. Their reigns were different in every way, yet together they formed the spine of the Tudor legacy. Mary ruled with her mother's faith, fierce, proud, and enduring. Her reign bore the scars of war, of suppression, of longing that history would judge too harshly. Yet without her, Elizabeth could never have stood where she did. Elizabeth ruled with her mother's fire, clever, watchful, untamed. Her reign was long, filled with golden myths and deep uncertainties, but in time, it would be called a golden age. Their father had changed the country with force, but his daughters changed it through endurance, through vision, through silence, when silence was safest, through speech, when speech was everything. Mary's memory lives not only in the mistakes people recite, but in the courage it took to stand alone. Elizabeth's memory lives not only in portraits and plays, but in the way she held a crown without needing a man beside her. Together, they closed the chapter their father began, one by reclaiming a mother's name, the other by wearing her mother's strength. Their legacies are not carved in gold, but in the tension between shadow and light, in choices made against the tide, in thrones sat upon by women who were never supposed to sit at all. Echoes in the Abbey. If you walk through Westminster Abbey, past the ancient tombs and silent chapels, you will find them. Mary and Elizabeth, buried together beneath a single stone, sisters in death, though not always in life. Above them, an inscription speaks not of rivalry or blood, but of unity, of peace, of queens who bore the same burden, the same crown. Elizabeth lies atop Mary, her effigy carved in quiet majesty. The Latin words carved into the stone read, "Partners in throne and grave," a poetic truth, a final reconciliation, and nearby, in the same abbey, lie their mother and grandmother, Anne Boleyn's legacy silent, but not forgotten. Catherine of Aragon's piety remembered in quiet corners. Westminster holds more than kings. It holds the breath of women who shaped the throne, not just with power, but with memory, with grief, with love that outlasted life. Their father, Henry VIII, is buried elsewhere, alone beside Jane Seymour, the one who gave him a son. But the future did not belong to the son who died young. It belonged to the daughters, and so the Abbey keeps their story, in stone, in shadow, in silence that echoes with footsteps from centuries past. Mary and Elizabeth, daughters of wives remembered, not because they were perfect, but because they endured, because they took what was broken and tried to shape something new. Their reigns closed the wound their father had opened. And from that wound rose a new England, one shaped not by the hands of men, but by the hearts of two women who had every reason to disappear and instead chose to rise. Chapter 11. The Reformation Crown. The storm did not come with thunder, nor did it roar into the streets. It crept in quietly, behind closed doors and whispered councils, until one day the bells of England rang for a church no longer Roman. This was no ordinary quarrel. What began as a king's longing for a male heir, a matter of the heart wrapped in politics, had now become something far more sacred, far more shattering. England stood on a precipice, and the old faith stood beside her, trembling. For centuries, the soul of England had been tethered to Rome. In chapels and cathedrals, in morning prayers and evening rites, the people found comfort in tradition. Latin, Mass, saints in stained glass, relics kissed, and hymns sung. The Pope was far, but not distant. He was the shepherd, and England his flock. But Henry VIII, the king with a restless crown and a desperate need for a son, found himself bound by a church that would not bend to his desire. The Pope had denied his request to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And so, in a move that would scar Christendom, Henry chose to break the chain. It did not happen in one swift cut. First came arguments, then pamphlets, scholars, and clergy who questioned the reach of papal power. A seed was planted, not of disbelief, but of disobedience. Could a king, crowned by divine right, not also speak for God in his own land? And slowly, from court to cathedral, that question became law. The Reformation had not begun in flames, but in ink and silence, until it spread like smoke into every parish, every prayer. What Henry taught was not just an allegiance, it was a world. The divide was not only between Rome and London, but between neighbour and neighbour, father and son, wife and husband. England's heart was no longer whole. One faith had split into two, and the wound was fresh, red, and raw. The Act of Supremacy. In the year 1534, with Parliament behind him and the Pope cast aside, Henry made it law. Not suggestion, not idea, law. By the Act of Supremacy, the King declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, not just in title, but in essence. He was now the bridge between crown and heaven. The Pope no longer held sway. The King's conscience would be the kingdom's command. It was more than paper. It was a declaration that God's authority now wore English robes and spoke with an English tongue. For centuries, kings had ruled bodies. Now, Henry would rule souls. In that simple stroke of ink, the crown became both sword and sermon. The church, once a realm beyond the reach of monarchs, was now Henry's to mould. And yet, the king's mind was not born for sermons. He did not hunger for doctrine, but for obedience. The Book of Common Prayer would come later, the theology still to be written. But this moment was not about faith. It was about power. It was about pulling the divine down from the heavens and placing it in the hands of a mortal king. The consequences were immediate. Priests swore new oaths. Bishops bowed to a different altar. Monasteries hesitated. People whispered. For the common folk, it was bewildering. Yesterday's saints were today's idolatry. Yesterday's pope was now an outsider, a foreign prince. And yet, the sermons told them this was God's will. The king had declared it so. For Henry, the church was no longer a separate kingdom. It was his instrument. His voice echoed in pulpits. His enemies were not just traitors, they were heretics. To disobey him was to disobey God. The robes of royalty now cloaked the sanctuary, and the cross, once lifted in Roman hands, now belonged to the English crown. Oaths and executions. But not all bowed. Some stood still when the wind changed. Among them, Sir Thomas More, once Henry's friend and chancellor, a man of quiet conscience and deep conviction. He did not speak loudly. He did not raise a rebellion. He merely refused to sign the oath. The oath of supremacy required not only loyalty in action, but in belief. It asked men to acknowledge Henry not just as king, but as the true head of Christ's church on earth. To say yes was survival. To say no or say nothing at all, was death, silence. Once seen as humility became defiance, and defiance in Henry's court was treason. More believed in duty, in the quiet laws of the soul. He could not place a crown above a cross, and for that, he was led to the scaffold. The grass beneath the Tower of London remembers his final words. "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." They were soft words, not rebellious, not angry, but in them was the sound of a kingdom cracking. Others followed. Bishops, monks, scholars, men and women whose only crime was to think differently, to believe as they had always believed. In Henry's New England, there was no room for divided hearts. One church, one ruler, one truth. The executions did not come as waves, but as ripples. Enough to remind the nation that belief was now a matter of state. Martyrs rose from both sides, Protestant and Catholic. Each saw themselves as protectors of truth, even as the axe fell. And through it all, Henry watched, not with cruelty, but with the cold resolve of a man who would not be questioned. He did not thirst for blood, but he demanded unity. And unity, under this new crown, came at a terrible price. A realm rebuilt in fear, it began with bricks, with the slow dissolution of monasteries, those ancient sanctuaries that had stood for centuries, where the sick were healed, the poor fed, and prayers offered for the dead. One by one, they were emptied, statues shattered, gold seized, windows darkened. What had once been holy ground was now property of the king. Some wept, others scavenged. The monks walked away in silence, robes clutched to their chests, their lives uprooted by decree. It wasn't just buildings that were lost, it was memory. The sound of bells at dawn, the scent of incense, the rhythm of prayer that had marked the hours, all gone. A sacred rhythm replaced by royal command. In place of relics, royal arms, in place of shrines, the king's crest. The landscapes of faith were torn apart, not with fire, but with quiet orders carried by royal agents. England's hills, once dotted with abbeys, now bore the ruins of what was. To speak against it was treason. To hold on to an old rosary was suspicion. Children learned a new creed. Priests rewrote their sermons. The old Latin tongue faded. English prayers filled the air. What had once felt eternal now seemed fragile, changeable, uncertain. And yet beneath it all, a current of fear. For even as Henry remade the church in his image, the people did not know where this new road would lead. Could one man truly carry the weight of divine authority? Could the sacred be shaped by royal desire? This was no longer just about wives or heirs. It was about the soul of a kingdom. And while the crown gleamed brighter, the people bowed lower, not in reverence, but in uncertainty. What remained was a nation transformed. A land once bound to Rome now charted its own spiritual course. But the cost was high. England was no longer just a kingdom. It was a church, a pulpit and a throne combined. And in that merging, something fragile was lost. The sky above the towers of Westminster was the same. The river still flowed past the stones of London, but something in the air had changed. It was quieter, more watchful. England had been reborn, but not in joy, in silence, in surrender, in shadows, and the Reformation. Crown, heavy with both power and sorrow, now rested on a king whose soul still searched for peace. Chapter 12. The king's shadow grows. Once, Henry had been the golden prince of Christendom. a king with laughter in his chest and the vigor of youth in his stride. He rode like the wind, danced like flame, and laughed as though the world bent only for his joy. England had seen its monarch not as a ruler to fear, but a man to admire, athletic, articulate, handsome, and hungry for glory. But fate is never kind to those who believe themselves invincible. In January of 1536, while jousting at Greenwich, Henry fell. His horse collapsed onto him with a force that would echo through history. For 2 long hours, the king lay unconscious, and though he survived, something inside him did not. His legs, once the strength of his body, failed him. He was left with ulcers that would never fully heal, flesh that ached and swelled, and a spirit embittered by constant pain. The court did not say it aloud, but they saw it. The king, who had once moved like a stag through the hunt, now limped behind silk screens and was carried when no one could see. His body grew larger, his face lost its softness, and his eyes, once warm, grew watchful and strange. The cheer that had filled Henry's halls faded, and in its place, silence grew like ivy over stone. Pain, they say, makes a man more aware of what can be taken. Henry became consumed not only by his injuries, but by the knowledge that even kings bleed. He brooded on betrayal, mulled over defiance, and came to see plots in every quiet conversation. Trust, once given freely, was now guarded behind glances and questions. The boy king was gone. In his place stood a monarch, slowly being hollowed by pain, both physical and unseen. A court of intrigue. At Henry's side now stood a court that glittered, but did not gleam. The nobles wore fine cloth, and the tapestries hung heavy with gold, but the air was thick with tension. Every word carried weight, every look a hidden message. For in Henry's world, favor was not a gift, it was a weapon. It could lift a man into glory or drop him into ruin with a whisper. Thomas Cromwell, once a common man of sharp wit and unmatched cunning, had risen higher than most dared dream. He had helped Henry achieve the impossible, the annulment from Catherine, the break from Rome, the rise of Anne Boleyn. He was the architect of revolution, both legal and spiritual. But in the Tudor court, those who rose too high cast long shadows, and those shadows often attracted suspicion. The death of Anne Boleyn, ordered by the very king who once adored her, marked a shift. Cromwell had orchestrated her fall to preserve the crown's dignity. But in doing so, he reminded Henry and the court just how dangerous ambition could be. The same hand that built could just as easily break. Whispers slithered through corridors like smoke. Noblemen turned against one another in hushed tones, each hoping to survive another day in a court where mood could shift with the king's aching leg. Letters were opened. Servants listened at doors. A glance, a joke, a misstep, all could spell disaster. Cromwell, ever sharp, knew this. He tried to keep pace with Henry's changing mind, but the man he served was no longer predictable. In 1540, after arranging a marriage with Anne of Cleves that displeased the king both in form and feeling, Cromwell lost his footing. The marriage failed. Henry fumed. And within months, the man who had once held the kingdom's future in his ink-stained hands was sent to the block. A court once built on strategy now danced to the rhythm of fear. Men survived not by being right, but by being invisible. And Henry, growing colder with each betrayal, ruled not by wisdom, but by impulse. The tyrant emerges. A king's court should reflect his heart. Once, Henry's England had felt like a land of possibility, open, curious, full of reform. But now it mirrored its master, wounded, volatile, and growing more distant by the day. The mask of benevolence slipped. Where once Henry had listened to counsel, now he demanded submission. Parliament passed his laws, but they were not crafted through debate. They were dictated by decree. Those who hesitated were labelled traitors, and traitors did not die quietly. Men who had dined with the king, danced at his side, or prayed with him beneath cathedral arches, now walked the lonely path to execution. The lines between loyalty and betrayal blurred. To disagree was to risk death. Even silence could be dangerous. Thomas More, John Fisher, Anne Boleyn, Thomas Cromwell. Their stories differed, but the ending was the same. Henry had grown intolerant of contradiction. The man who once wrote love letters in Latin and played the lute now ruled with suspicion wrapped tightly around his crown. His eyes saw enemies in every corner. His heart, once stirred by music and beauty, hardened like iron. Even those he loved were not safe. Wives came and went, some with grace, others with horror. And those around him, both noble and servant alike, learned to walk lightly, to speak softly, and never to assume tomorrow. This was not the tyranny of rage, it was colder than that. Henry's cruelty was not wild, it was deliberate. It came dressed in robes of law, but smelled of fear. Even his affection, when given, was edged with danger. To be the king's favourite was to risk everything, for favour could melt in an instant, like frost touched by morning sun. The hollow throne. In the end, the crown sits heavy, not just on the brow, but on the soul. And Henry's soul, though wrapped in ermine and guarded by the walls of Whitehall, was restless and alone. He had wealth beyond imagining, palaces filled with tapestries and silver, chapels that echoed with choral hymns. And yet, within all that grandeur, there was emptiness. For what does a man gain if he loses those he once loved? Catherine of Aragon, gone, sent away to die in cold exile. Anne Boleyn, silenced, executed by his own command. Jane Seymour, dead after giving him the son he so desperately desired. Anne of Cleves, divorced. Catherine Howard, beheaded. Only Catherine Parr remained, patient and wise, walking through the final years of his reign with careful grace. His children, too, were distant. Mary, once the apple of his eye, had been declared illegitimate and forced into obedience. Elizabeth, born of Anne, was clever but cautious. And Edward, his son, the boy for whom all this had begun, was still just a child, a quiet shadow, waiting in the wings. In dreams, perhaps, Henry saw them. The women, the children, the friends, now gone. Perhaps he heard the bells of old monasteries ringing in his memory, felt the whisper of Catherine's prayers, or the laughter of Anne before it all unraveled. But when he woke, all he had was silence. His body ached, his legs swelled. The throne, beneath him, carved and jeweled, felt less like a seat of power and more like a prison. He ruled a nation, yes. But at what cost? The courtiers still bowed, the choirs still sang, but Henry sat above them, a man wrapped in titles and robes, haunted by choices that could not be undone. The crown that once promised legacy now delivered only ghosts. And in the stillness of the night, when candles flickered low and the great halls emptied of sound, the king's shadow stretched long across the stone, larger than any man, yet emptier than anyone could see. For Henry VIII, ruler of England, master of church and state, was still just a man, and the throne, no matter how gilded, could not hold the weight of sorrow. Chapter 13. The Blood of Monasteries. There was once a silence in the English countryside, a kind of sacred quiet. It lived between the stone walls of abbeys and echoed in the morning chants of monks. For centuries, these monasteries had been more than places of worship. They were the soul of the nation, gentle sanctuaries where time moved slower, where the poor were fed and the dead remembered. Books were copied by hand, candles lit for the sick, and gold chalices lifted in reverent hands. But under Henry's new rule, silence took on a different shape. By royal order, the monasteries were no longer to be revered, but dismantled. What had once been sacred became suspect. The cloisters, with their tiled courtyards and ivy-covered arches, were judged corrupt, not in spirit, but in wealth. Henry, flush with authority and burdened with expenses, looked upon the riches of the church not as offerings to God, but as resources to claim, and so began the dissolution. One by one, the abbeys were evaluated, weighed, and judged. Agents of the crown, some eager, others uneasy, arrived with ledgers in hand. Gold chalices were seized, their holy purpose forgotten. Crucifixes were melted. Libraries, filled with centuries of scripture, history, and philosophy, were emptied, their pages tossed into fires or sold to merchants. Even the bells, those sweet-sounding voices that once called the faithful to prayer, were taken down and melted for cannon or coin. The monks, bewildered and broken-hearted, were turned out with modest pensions or scattered to lesser parishes. Some resisted, some wept. Many simply walked away, their robes dragging behind them like shadows on stone. Their homes, places that had known nothing but prayer and silence, now echoed with the hammering of dismantling crews and the crack of shattered altar stones. These were not just buildings, they were memories. And as each one fell, something ancient within England fell with it. The pilgrimage of grace. But not all of England bowed in silence. Far to the north, where the land rolled in soft hills and the people held tightly to the old ways, a different sound began to stir. It was not the sound of rebellion born from ambition, but of sorrow turned to defiance. Farmers, priests, and townsfolk gathered, not with swords raised in conquest, but with banners lifted in prayer. They called it the Pilgrimage of Grace. Led by Robert Aske, a man of law and principle, thousands of common souls rose together, not against the crown itself, but against what the crown had become. They marched beneath emblems of the 5 wounds of Christ, stitched lovingly by village hands. Their message was simple and deeply felt. Restore the monasteries, restore the faith, restore the peace that once lived in the land. This was not a mob of outlaws. These were men and women of faith, teachers, bakers, nuns, even noblemen. They marched to protect the sacred, to guard the memory of a time when the church was not a target, but a home. Their journey was solemn and strange, a protest that felt more like a pilgrimage. They did not plunder. They prayed. They held mass in open fields. And when they reached York, their numbers swelled to the tens of thousands. It was the largest uprising of Henry's reign, not fueled by greed, but by grief. The king, alarmed and momentarily unsure, did not send armies at first. He sent promises, promises made, promises broken. Henry, distant in London but well informed, understood the threat. He knew that steel alone could not silence a movement born from belief. So, he offered something softer. Words. He wrote of mercy, of understanding. He claimed he had heard their cries and that their concerns would be addressed. He sent envoys bearing royal pardons, stamped with seals and signed in his name. And so, the pilgrims, weary, hopeful, laid down their arms. They returned home, believing they had been heard. But what Henry promised in the day, he reversed in the night. As the northern roads emptied and the people returned to their hearths, the gallows were built. Quietly, methodically. Robert Asker was summoned to London under the pretense of counsel. He came in peace. He never returned. Soon after, the arrests began. Not just of leaders, but of parish priests, elderly monks, even village boys who had marched with the banners. Trials were swift, the punishments brutal. Men were hanged in town squares. Some were drawn and quartered, their deaths made public, their bodies left as warnings. The message was clear. Obedience was not optional. The North, once proud in its quiet faith, now lived in fear. Families buried their old crucifixes. Priests altered their prayers. The countryside, once alive with the sound of sacred processions, grew still, not in peace, but in silence. Henry had offered pardon, but he returned punishment, and in that betrayal, something in the people broke, a nation redrawn. When the dust settled and the final banners were burned, the landscape of England was forever changed. The abbeys, now hollow and roofless, stood like skeletons across the hills. Stone by stone, many were dismantled and carted away. Their walls used to build manor houses or new fortresses. Where once incense had risen, smoke from chimneys now curled. Where once monks had walked in silence, soldiers now stood with muskets and polished boots. Some cathedrals were spared, transformed into Anglican strongholds, rebranded and repurposed. Their saints removed, their relics discarded, the sacred repainted as state property. It was not merely a change of decoration, it was a change of soul. In the cities, new laws dictated how one could pray. English replaced Latin. The Book of Common. Prayer became the script of salvation. Pulpits no longer bowed to Rome, but to the throne. And throughout the realm, shrines to saints were torn down, as if to erase the very memory of what had been. What had once been a land of holy places was now a land of control. The church was no longer a refuge. It was an arm of the crown. And so the spirit of the old England, the quiet, contemplative land of monasteries and meadows, faded. In its place rose a nation that watched, obeyed, and feared. But the stones remembered, the broken arches of Tintern Abbey, the windswept ruins of Rievaulx, the silent cloisters of Glastonbury. They remained, not in function, but in form, like ghosts made of mortar and memory. Visitors came in later years and whispered in awe, not of what stood, but of what had been lost. The England that rose from the Reformation was powerful, centralized, wealthy. But something had gone missing, a gentleness, a sacred stillness, a devotion that had lived not in crowns or laws, but in the quiet rituals of ordinary lives. And in the end, those quiet places, robbed of their gold, stripped of their books, left behind something no king could fully destroy: the memory of faith before power, of prayer before decree, and of a time when silence was not fear, but reverence. Chapter 14. The Fall of Cromwell. In the great halls of Henry's court, where words whispered behind velvet could change a man's fate, Thomas Cromwell moved like shadow and steel. He was not born into silk or shielded by nobility. He was the son of a blacksmith, a man of ink, not armor. But through cunning, learning, and a talent for quiet survival, he rose farther than anyone thought possible. At first, he served Wolsey. Then, when Wolsey fell, he stepped into the space left behind, not with force, but with precision. Piece by piece, Cromwell became the mind behind the crown, orchestrating the break from Rome, dissolving monasteries, and writing laws that reshaped the kingdom in Henry's image. He was not beloved by many, but he was respected by all. And, most important of all, he was trusted by the king. But in Henry's world, trust had a price. The closer a man stood to the king, the more likely he was to burn. Power, once gained, was never secure. It had to be protected constantly. With wit, obedience, and the ability to sense a change in wind before it ever touched the curtains. Cromwell knew this. And yet, even he could not stop the inevitable tide that was beginning to rise beneath him. He had helped Henry find freedom from Catherine. He had sealed Anne Boleyn's fate. He had filled the king's coffers with the wealth of the church. But Henry was a king of appetite, always needing more, always looking for the next answer to his aching heart. And when a king grows restless, the man nearest his throne must tread most carefully. In the spring of 1540, Cromwell still stood tall, but the foundation beneath him was beginning to crack. A marriage that backfires. To secure peace with the Protestant states of Germany, Cromwell arranged a marriage for Henry, not of love, but of alliance. Her name was Anne of Cleves. She was modest, plain, kind, and unknown to Henry. A portrait was painted, carefully crafted to flatter. When Henry saw it, he approved. When he met her, everything changed. She was not what he expected, not the image he had imagined. And Henry, now older, wounded and heavy with suspicion, recoiled. He called her a Flanders mare, ridiculing her appearance and declaring that he could not bring himself to consummate the union. What had been meant to strengthen Henry's hand in Europe instead wounded his pride at home. And Cromwell, the architect of this marriage, stood directly in the line of fire. The court watched with silent anticipation. The nobles who had long resented Cromwell's rise, who had scoffed at this commoner shaping kingship, saw their chance. They whispered. They waited. They circled like hawks over a wounded hare. The marriage lasted 6 months. It was annulled quickly, quietly. Anne was given a generous settlement and treated with respect. But for Cromwell, the damage had been done. Henry felt mocked, betrayed, and in his frustration, he looked not inward, but at the man who had brought Anne to him. In a single misstep, Cromwell had gone from trusted minister to tolerated mistake. And in Henry's court, there was no tolerance for long, no trial, no mercy. The summons came with little warning. It was a summer day when Cromwell was arrested at a council meeting. One moment, he was speaking of state affairs. The next, he was seized. There was no trial, no defense, no time to gather thoughts. He was sent to the Tower, the very place where he had once sent others. The walls he had passed as a master, he now passed as a prisoner. The letters he wrote from his cell were desperate, pleading for the king's mercy, for understanding. He had been loyal, he reminded Henry. He had served without rest. He had broken the old world to build the king a new one. But the king did not answer, and even if he had, Henry's mind had already shifted. Cromwell's enemies now filled the court. The Duke of Norfolk, with noble blood and a long memory, rejoiced in the fall. Others who had feared Cromwell's intellect now celebrated his disgrace. The charges were vague: heresy, treason, overreach. They were tools, not truths. The law, once sharpened by Cromwell's own hand, now turned against him. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led to the scaffold. He wore a plain shirt, no robes, no honours. just the trembling dignity of a man who had seen too much, risen too far, and finally fallen beyond saving. He forgave those who condemned him. He prayed for the king's health. And then, with one swing of the axe, the mind that had restructured England was silenced. That same day, in a cruel twist of the court's rhythm, Henry married again. The wheel turns again. Catherine Howard, young, beautiful, spirited, became Henry's fifth wife. Barely 17, she was a cousin of Anne Boleyn and a niece of the Duke of Norfolk. In her rose-pink gowns and shy glances, Henry saw a flicker of something he had long missed: youth. She was everything Anne of Cleves was not: playful, gentle, flattering, and, most importantly, English. Her rise marked a shift, not just in Henry's affections, but in his court. The conservative faction, led by Norfolk, now basked in favour. Reformers stepped back. The religious fires Cromwell had stoked were cooled. The pendulum had swung again. Henry, now in his late 40s, clung to Catherine as if she might return, something lost. She made him feel younger, desired, alive. He adorned her with jewels, called her his rose without a thorn. But roses, even the most delicate, can hide secrets beneath their petals. For now, though, the king smiled. The court breathed, and yet the air did not feel lighter. Because beneath the music and celebration, something had shifted in the soul of England. Cromwell's fall had been more than a man's demise. It had been a reminder that power in Henry's court was fleeting, that favour was conditional, that no man, no matter how brilliant or devoted, was safe. The throne, once guided by counsellors and careful minds, was now ruled by appetite and mood. Cromwell had reformed the kingdom, but in the end, he could not reform the king. And so, the wheel turned once more, grinding quietly beneath the weight of ambition, fear, and fate. Chapter 15. The Cost of Queenship. She came to court like spring after a long, cruel winter, bright, delicate, full of fragrance and colour. Catherine Howard was barely 17, a girl wrapped in silks too fine for her years, with laughter, still caught between innocence and admiration. She had the smile of someone untouched by shadow, someone who believed that beauty alone might soften the sharp edges of power. But power does not soften. She was the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, a family name thick with ambition, and the cousin of Anne Boleyn, whose story was written in blood. Yet Catherine carried no fear. Perhaps she did not remember what became of Anne, or perhaps she believed she could charm fate into forgiveness. After all, hadn't Henry called her his rose without a thorn? Hadn't he smiled like a younger man when she danced? Henry, now old and ailing, looked upon her as a final spark, the last flicker of youth he could grasp before the night took it away. She was soft where the world had hardened him, gentle where his own heart had grown brittle. He dressed her in rubies, called her sweet names, and built her a court filled with music again. For a moment, the air around the king lightened. He was no longer just ruler, but suitor. But Catherine was not Anne of Cleves, older, worldly, cautious. She was not Jane Seymour, demure and dutiful. She was a girl, raised in the distracted care of a noble household, flirtatious, eager to please, and woefully unprepared for the weight of a crown. And so, as she stepped into the role once held by Anne Boleyn, the walls of Whitehall seemed to tighten around her. She had not entered a palace. She had entered a den of lions, where every smile might hide a tooth, and every whisper might be her undoing. Secrets uncovered. For a time, the court danced for her. Courtiers bowed, musicians played, and the tapestries rustled with cheer. But beneath the laughter, the past began to stir. It always does. There were whispers, quiet at first, then louder, drawn from the corridors of her childhood. Before she wore the crown, Catherine had been playful, spirited, and perhaps careless. In the Duchess of Norfolk's household, she had exchanged letters, glances, and promises with men not suited for queens. Among them was Francis Derham, a former lover who believed himself wronged, not just by her heart, but by her sudden rise to royalty. And now, others began to speak, some out of loyalty to the king, others out of bitterness. The truth came not as a sword, but as a slow leak. Letters discovered, confessions drawn, names named under pressure. It was not a matter of when she was unfaithful, or how deeply. It was that the air around her had turned from sweet to suspicious. One name surfaced again and again: Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber. Handsome, young, too close to the queen. They had met in secret, it was said. There were notes, tokens, murmured arrangements in the dark. When Henry learned of it, he did not shout. He grew quiet. He had believed in her, adored her, built a world around the illusion of her purity. And now that illusion shattered like glass across the cold stone floor. For a man who had executed one queen already, the memory was too sharp to ignore. The investigation was swift and the evidence damning. Catherine denied little. Perhaps she had hoped it would be forgiven, that love or youth or tears might soften judgment. But in Henry's England, the price of betrayal was absolute. The final dance. The Tower of London stood still beneath a grey November sky as Catherine Howard was brought within its walls. She did not cry at first. She walked softly, her hands folded, her face pale. But inside her, a storm had begun. She was still just a girl, barely 19, and already she had outlived the dreams of her own story. She had once danced in the great halls. Now she paced in a stone chamber, counting the steps between life and death. It is said, though the stone does not speak, that Catherine asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her. She wished to practice, not out of vanity, not out of pride, but to prepare her body for what her soul could not yet understand. A young woman rehearsing her death, like a scene in a play that could not be rewritten. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, she stepped into the courtyard, dressed in black velvet. The cold bit at her skin, but she did not shiver. Witnesses say she spoke clearly, asked for forgiveness, and laid her head with quiet grace. One breath, then none. The blade fell, and with it, the final joy Henry had known in his waning years. The music stopped. The court wore mourning, but few mourned aloud. They had seen queens rise and queens fall. They had learned to keep their grief hidden, their loyalty flexible, their prayers quiet. Catherine's body was buried near her cousin, Anne, beneath the cold stones of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Two queens, two tragedies, resting side by side in the same silent earth. The ghost queen time passes. Kings die, empires shift, but stories remain, especially those whispered after dark. They say Catherine still runs through the corridors of Hampton Court, that her footsteps echo in the gallery where she once fled, begging for mercy. She had run toward the king's chapel, hoping to reach him before the guards did, hoping he might forgive her if he saw her face. But she never reached him. The doors were closed. And now, in the silence of the palace, Some say she runs still. Visitors have reported hearing her. Light feet on polished stone, a sob just around the corner, a presence in the hallway no one can explain. Whether ghost or memory, something of Catherine lingers. Not the queen of pageants and portraits, but the girl, lost, trembling, caught between love and judgment, youth and execution. Hers was not a reign of power, but of tragedy, and yet, in her short time, she left an imprint deeper than many rulers who lived twice as long. Perhaps it is because her story is so human, a tale of innocence in a world that punishes naivety, of dreams that dared to bloom in the shadow of tyranny, a reminder that even roses without thorns can still be crushed. Henry, after her death, would never be the same. His body weakened, his heart hardened. He had loved again and lost again, and the throne that had once gleamed with hope now sat beneath a darkening crown. Catherine's life had been short, her reign even shorter, but her story of laughter turned to silence, of youth met by steel, endures, and somewhere in the still halls of Hampton Court, the echo of her final steps reminds us, beauty is not protection, love is not armor, and queenship, under a king like Henry, always came at a cost. Chapter 16. The Queen Who Loved Books. By the time Catherine Parr came to court, the fires of youth had long burned out in the palace of Henry VIII. The grand pageants, the midnight dances, the whispered love letters, all had faded into smoke and silence. What remained was a kingdom worn down by grief and fear, and a king swollen with pain, both of the body and of the soul. Catherine was not chosen for her beauty, though she carried grace with quiet dignity. She was not chosen to bear heirs, though she had once dreamed of children. She was chosen because she could listen and because she could think. Henry, broken by loss and betrayal, no longer sought passion. He needed peace. She was a widow twice over, familiar with death and sorrow. And unlike the girls who had come before her, Catherine came not with dreams of fairy tale romance, but with books in her arms and wisdom in her eyes. She understood the man behind the crown, the one hidden behind layers of ceremony and pain. She spoke to his mind when others feared his moods. She soothed his pride, not with flattery, but with presence. Where Catherine Howard had been a spark, Catherine Parr was a steady candle, not flickering, constant. She did not try to change the king. She tried to calm him, and in doing so, she became something none of the others had fully managed to be, his equal, not in power, but in thought, not in title, but in understanding. Books and belief. Catherine Parr believed in the soul, not as something owned by the church, but as something every person carried within. And for her, the way to reach God was not through relics or rituals, but through reading, thinking, praying, from the heart. She read constantly, her hands often ink-stained, her mind forever reaching into pages written by scholars, saints, and reformers. She studied theology as men did, not as curiosity, but as conviction. And then, bravely, quietly, she wrote. In 1545, while Queen, Catherine published prayers or meditations, the first English book ever printed under a queen's name. She did not boast of it. She did not parade her intellect. She offered it like a prayer, gentle, thoughtful, personal. And still she went further. Her next work, The Lamentation of a Sinner, dared to speak plainly about a soul's direct relationship with God, free from the grip of clergy or Rome. These were bold ideas in a court where religious tensions still simmered under every robe and ribbon. But Catherine believed the written word could heal. She read aloud to Henry in the evenings, softening his rage with psalms and philosophy. She taught his children to read the scriptures in English, planting seeds of thought in minds once clouded by politics. To her, faith was not political, it was intimate, a conversation between the heart and the divine. And in a palace so often filled with noise, Catherine Parr gave God a quieter place to speak. Tension behind pages, but thought in Henry's court was never free. There were men who watched Catherine's mind with suspicion, men who had seen what happened when queens grew too bold, too clever, too sure of their own truth. The memory of Anne Boleyn still clung to the corridors. Beneath the surface of Catherine's calm, danger brewed. Conservative courtiers, those who still clung to the old ways, whispered of her writings, of the gatherings she held with other Protestant thinkers, of the books she kept by her bedside. In 1546, the whispers became a plot. A warrant was drawn. Catherine Parr, Queen of England, was to be arrested for heresy. She learned of it in time. It is said that she went to the king and knelt beside him, not with fear, but with wisdom. She did not argue. She did not defend. She spoke of obedience, of the king's knowledge. She told him that all she knew, she learned from him. Henry, swollen with gout, dulled by age, softened. The arrest never came. But the lesson was clear. Even books, even belief, could be dangerous. Catherine continued to read, but more carefully. She continued to write, but more softly, and the court, though it still smiled, watched her more closely. In her chambers, the Bible remained open, but the doors stayed shut. A caretaker of a broken house. If Catherine Parr had been queen only to Henry, her legacy would still be remarkable. But her true gift was not just to the king, it was to the children left in his wake. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, three souls touched by loss, isolation, and the confusion of growing up in a house where love could be dangerous and silence safer than truth. Catherine became more mother than monarch. To Mary, she showed kindness without condition, honoring her as a princess, even as others had tried to erase her title. To Edward, the boy Henry saw as his future, she gave structure and calm. Lessons in scripture, lessons in language, lessons in compassion. But it was Elizabeth who bloomed most in Catherine's care. The young girl, clever and quiet, had lived through her own mother's execution. She had watched queens rise and fall, but with Catherine, she found something rare: stability. Catherine taught her to read deeply, to speak thoughtfully, to lead with her mind. Together, they studied Latin and Greek. They spoke of politics and poetry. Catherine, perhaps unknowingly, shaped the future queen that Elizabeth would become, a monarch who would read more than most and rule longer than all. In a court where many had grasped for power, Catherine had given something gentler, the gift of education, of belief, and of emotional safety. As Henry's body failed, his ulcers worsening, his nights filled with pain, Catherine remained. She did not flee as others had. She brought him books. She eased his fevers. She prayed over him. She had not come to court seeking a crown, but she wore it with grace, not as a symbol of glory, but as a burden she bore with quiet strength. And when Henry died in 1547, it was Catherine Parr who stood with the children, carrying not the torch of empire, but the softer light of wisdom, passed from hand to hand, like a candle in the dark. Chapter 17. the sons and daughters of Henry. In the cold light of a January morning in 1547, the crown that had weighed so heavily on the head of Henry VIII was passed to a child. Edward, his only legitimate son, the boy for whom kingdoms, had been reshaped, marriages annulled, and churches torn from Rome, now wore the golden circle. He was just 9 years old. Small, delicate, with pale skin and thoughtful eyes, he looked more like a scholar than a king. Yet he was a Tudor, and every inch of him carried the pressure of a nation. He had been raised to rule, educated by the finest minds in Europe, and surrounded by the hopes of a court that saw in him a pure and righteous future. Edward was bright, sharp in mind and devout in heart. He read Latin as easily as English, studied scripture with deep concentration, and believed with unshakable certainty in the Protestant path his father had paved. But the boy was also fragile, thin in frame, often unwell, prone to coughing fits and long spells of fatigue. Even as the crown was lowered onto his head, some whispered that it might not rest there for long. A council ruled in his name, led by his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, and later by the ruthless Duke of Northumberland. These men steered England through the stormy years of the Reformation, dismantling what remained of the old faith and replacing it with English prayers, stripped altars, and whitewashed walls. Edward watched and listened, learning more than anyone expected. And as he grew, he began to write his own thoughts, his own orders, his own will into the margins of power. He was not a puppet. He was a prince formed by books and belief. But time was not on his side. By 1553, at just 15 years, old Edward was dying. Tuberculosis gripped his lungs and withered his strength. He could feel his kingdom slipping from him, and with it, the Reformation he held so dear. In desperation, he tried to rewrite succession, bypassing his half-sisters to crown Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin. But the boy who had carried the crown did not live to defend his choice. He died quietly, his dreams unfinished, his country already moving without him. Mary, the daughter who remembered. When Edward passed, power did not fall into silence. It erupted. For 9 days, Lady Jane Grey reigned, a girl of 16, caught between ambition and accident. But England remembered Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and Mary remembered everything. She remembered the day her mother was cast aside. She remembered the title princess taken from her lips. She remembered the tears, the shame, the exile. And now, she returned not as a cast-off, but as queen. England, torn between old and new, watched with uncertain hearts. Mary had been raised in the old faith, taught to pray in Latin, to kneel before saints, to believe in the Pope as God's voice on earth. And now, after years of silence, she was free to restore what she had lost. She moved quickly. Churches reopened their altars. Mass returned in Latin. Bishops loyal to Rome were restored. But Mary's heart, once so tender, had hardened in exile. What had been personal became political, and politics in her reign turned to fire. The Marian. Persecutions began as law, but ended in flames. Protestants, men and women, nobles and commoners, were arrested, tried, and burned at the stake for heresy. Some died quietly. Others sang hymns through the smoke. The air in towns like Oxford and Smithfield filled with the scent of charred wood and ash. Mary believed she was saving souls, but England saw only suffering. They called her Bloody Mary, and yet, beneath the title lived a woman deeply alone, still mourning her mother, abandoned by her husband, unable to carry a child. The crown had given her power, but not peace. Her reign lasted just 5 years. When she died in 1558, the bells tolled with more relief than grief. Her dream of a Catholic England died with her. But Mary had left a legacy nonetheless. A cautionary tale of faith turned into fury, of memory turned into rule. Elizabeth, the heir of ambition. She had survived the fall of her mother. She had survived being declared a bastard, being locked in the Tower, being watched with suspicion by queens and kings alike. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, had been written off by many, but never forgotten by history. Now, she stepped into the throne room with measured grace. She was 25, sharp-eyed, sharp-minded, and utterly alone. Yet she wore power like armor, tailored, polished, and radiant. From her first moment as queen, Elizabeth understood what her siblings had not. Rule was not about religion. It was about balance, about survival, about giving the people something beautiful to believe in. She brought back Protestantism, but gently. Churches reopened, but without flames. Priests preached in English, but not in fear. Her England would not be one of persecution. It would be one of image, of narrative, of spectacle and myth. She never married, never handed her power to a king. She became, in her words, married to England. Her body belonged to no man. Her reign belonged to the people. Under Elizabeth, England changed. The arts flourished. Shakespeare wrote. Marlowe challenged minds. The sea became a stage for ambition, with explorers like Drake and Raleigh pushing outward, chasing empire and glory. She ruled for 45 years, and though she was the daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn, a woman hated, hunted, and erased, Elizabeth made her name echo louder than any who had come before. Golden-haired, golden-tongued, golden-aged, she became the queen that even kings feared to follow. Legacy in human form. When Henry VIII died, he believed his legacy would be carved in stone, in the laws he wrote, in the church he shattered, in the line of sons he so desperately craved. But his sons did not last. Edward died young. His other male heirs, illegitimate or unrecognized, faded into quiet deaths or dangerous rebellions. It was his daughters, declared illegitimate, overlooked and underestimated, who bore his crown with the greatest consequence. Mary brought back the past. Elizabeth built the future. Between them, they held England in their hands for half a century. And though Henry ruled by fear, it was his daughters who taught England resilience, through suffering, through intellect, through the strange, painful inheritance of power. The Tudor line would end with Elizabeth. No children, no heirs, but by then, it didn't matter. For the real legacy of Henry VIII was not his wives, not his wars, not even his break from Rome. It was his children, each one a reflection of a part of him. Edward, the mind; Mary, the memory; Elizabeth, the ambition. They were the story he could never control, the rulers he never imagined, and in their reigns, in their pain, their brilliance, their fire, the echoes of Henry lived on, not as orders shouted from a throne, but as history written in human form. Chapter 18. The King Who Changed Everything. History remembers him in fragments, the roaring tyrant with a swollen leg and a sharper temper, the prince turned patriarch who shattered an empire to chase a son, the king who ruled hearts and heads with equal force. But before the myth hardened into memory, before his name became a warning wrapped in a crown, Henry VIII was something else entirely. he was promise. Born in 1491, second son of the first Tudor king, Henry grew into a world still uncertain of its peace. Handsome, athletic, intelligent, he was a rare mixture of charm and command. He wrote music, played instruments, debated theology. People adored him. Foreign courts admired him. England believed in him. For a moment, he seemed destined to be the perfect Renaissance king. But power has its own gravity, and Henry's crown did not float above him. It grew heavier with every loss he suffered. He lost his brother. He lost his first son. He lost control over his legacy. And with each loss, something inside him hardened. The boy who once wrote sonnets in Latin became the man who signed death warrants with the flick of a pen. He could be generous, giving lands, titles, smiles. And he could be ruthless, stripping friends of freedom, even life, when loyalty cracked or doubt was seen. People did not just serve Henry, they orbited him, they feared him. They tried to read his moods like scripture. One day, a kiss on the hand, the next, a whisper in the tower. He was a king unlike any before him, not simply a ruler of land, but a sculptor of identity, for himself and for England. In his rise and fall, his brilliance and brutality, he became more than a man. He became a myth, a mirror that reflected every hope and horror of kingship, a monarch who began in light and ended in shadow. 6 wives, 1 kingdom. To speak of Henry is to speak of his wives, not as footnotes, but as chapters of his soul. Catherine of Aragon was his first, the Spanish princess who had once been wed to his brother. She was noble, faithful, and strong. For years, they were a golden pair. But when no son came and time wore thin, Henry's desire for legacy outweighed his vows. Their love ended not with silence, but with a nation split in two. Anne Boleyn followed, fierce, clever, and enchanting. She gave Henry passion, the thrill of danger, and the fire of rebellion. But the same fire that drew him in consumed her. When no son followed Elizabeth, Henry's love curdled. Anne's fate was sealed not by guilt, but by disappointment. Her head fell, and with it, the innocence of Henry's rule. Then came Jane, Seymour, quiet, devout, and kind. She bore him a son, and for that Henry loved her above all. But she died days later, leaving Henry with what he wanted most, and what he could never replace. Anne of Cleves was chosen from a portrait, a face on parchment that promised alliance. But love cannot be painted. He rejected her, though she outlived them all. She became his sister in title, and perhaps in peace. Catherine Howard, so young, so full of laughter, became his 5th wife. She brought colour to his winter, but she too bore secrets. Her past, uncovered, became her undoing. Her death, another scar. And finally, Catherine Parr, a woman of intellect, not intrigue. She soothed his wounds, guided his children, and lived, just long enough to see his story end. Each wife gave him something: alliance, affection, ambition, loss. Through their lives and their deaths, they shaped not only the man, but the kingdom. 6 queens, 1 king. And in their stories, the fate of a nation was written. The crown reforged. By the time the bells tolled for Henry's death in 1547, the England he left behind was not the England he had inherited. It was a kingdom reforged, not in gold, but in fire. The church no longer knelt to Rome. The monasteries had been emptied, their wealth poured into the crown, their relics scattered, their walls turned to dust. In their place rose a Church of England, loyal not to the Pope, but to the King. Doctrines still danced between old and new, but the centre of power had shifted, and it wore a Tudor face. The court had changed too. It was no longer a place of free thought and easy laughter. It was a theatre of survival. Noblemen spoke in measured tones. Courtiers bowed twice. Women curtsied deeper, smiled slower, and prayed that favour might last one more day. And the people, those far from the palaces and polished marble, lived in a realm of quiet confusion. Some rejoiced at the English Bible. Others mourned the loss of Latin Mass. All knew that to question the crown was to vanish. Yet in this fractured kingdom, there was still unity, not of belief, but of obedience. Henry's will had become the nation's spine, his desires, its law, his fears, its silence. He had not just ruled England, he had transformed it, altered its very rhythm, its breath, its understanding of itself. The monarchy, once bound by tradition, now stood at the center of everything. He had melted down the old world and molded something new in its place. And though his body decayed, heavy, pained, rotting from within, his grip on England remained. Even in death, his crown cast a long, wide shadow, echoes that still ring. Centuries have passed since Henry's final breath. Yet still, his story lingers. It lives in every portrait that stares too boldly from a gallery wall. In every history book that begins with a question and ends in awe. In every stage play, every classroom, every retelling where his name rises like a ghost. Because Henry is not simply remembered, he is wrestled with. He is the caution at the edge of power, the spark that began a reformation, the man who killed for love and loved what he could not keep. And then there are the wives, no longer silent victims of history but voices in their own right. Their names are spoken now with respect, curiosity, and even reverence. Catherine of Aragon, strong to the end. Anne Boleyn, wronged and brilliant. Jane Seymour, sweet and sorrowed. Anne of Cleves, the survivor. Catherine Howard, young and tragic. Catherine Parr, wise and enduring. They live in novels, films, lectures, poems. They haunt palaces. They inspire girls. They provoke thought. They remind us that history is not only shaped by kings, but by those who stood beside them, and sometimes beneath them. And so Henry remains, not as a ruler set in stone, but as a living question. What is power without peace? What is legacy without love? What becomes of a man who changes everything, but cannot change himself? In the quiet hours of night, when candles burn low, and the world listens with softer ears, his story plays again, not to celebrate, not to condemn, but to remember and to understand. A king, a country, 6 wives, one echo that still rings through time.